immediately establishing central influence. This opening gambit claims dominion over key squares and prepares for rapid development. Establishing central pawn presence immediately fights for board dominion. Asserting central influence immediately, this advance ignites a battle for key squares, potentially opening critical lines. Solidifying the center with this pawn advance prepares for a robust pawn chain and supports a queenside expansion. Asserting central control, this knight prepares for king's side development, reinforcing pawn structure against potential queen's gambit accepted complexities. Developing the knight gracefully secures the d5 pawn and prepares for kingside castling, a common theme in this opening. Solidifying the center and preparing further development, this move aims to control key squares while keeping options open. Black surrenders the central pawn for immediate queenside expansion, a common strategy in the Slav. Asserting central space and aiming to dislodge Black's queen pawn with a pawn sacrifice sets an aggressive tactical tone. Developing the bishop proactively contests central squares and prepares for potential pawn advances, showcasing good piece activity. Solidifying the center pawn and preparing for bishop development on g2. Consolidating central space, this development prepares to free the queen's bishop. Recapturing the pawn opens up diagonals for the bishop and prepares for central pawn expansion. A bishop now eyes the pinned knight, creating a positional bind and potential tactical fireworks. Securing the monarch allows for unified piece development, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing further piece activity. Solidifying the queenside and preparing for central expansion, the knight finds a more active post. Aggressively chasing the bishop disrupts Black's solid structure, but risks creating weaknesses. Regrouping the bishop to a more defensive posture acknowledges the knight's aggressive positioning while preparing to challenge White's central influence. Reinforcing the central pawn structure creates a solid foundation, albeit slightly restricting piece mobility. Retrieving the bishop to a more active diagonal offers excellent attacking potential. Striking at the wing, this aggressive pawn advance aims to dislodge the bishop and gain more space on the kingside, but exposes the king's defense. Initiating a central pawn thrust, this knight repositioning seeks to disrupt White's ambitious kingside expansion, injecting much-needed tactical dynamism. Connecting the rook streamlines development and prepares for central pawn thrusts. Bringing the bishop back offers a chance to develop the kingside more harmoniously and avoid immediate tactical complications. The knight reroutes, seeking more active diagonals while White strengthens the kingside pawn shield. This retreat signals a desire to regroup the bishop, seeking a safer haven and potentially preparing a future counterthrust. Exploiting the semi-open file, White boldly pushes forward, seeking to disrupt Black's central control and potentially expose the king. Cleverly exploiting the knight's new outpost, this piece prepares to disrupt White's central pawns and create active counterplay. Returning the queen to its original square reassures kingside safety and prepares for a central pawn push. Unleashing the central pawn aims to rupture White's pawn chain, potentially opening critical lines for Black's pieces. A quiet consolidation, positioning the bishop to support future central advances and potentially open lines. Castling achieves much-needed king safety and brings the rook into the game for potential action. Striking the center with a pawn thrust aims to disrupt Black's pawn structure and open lines for attack, creating dynamic complications. Seizing the central outpost with the knight creates a dynamic imbalance, challenging White's pawn structure. The bishop retreats, relinquishing the important diagonal and creating a pocket for Black's knight to potentially thrive. Simplifying to an endgame often favors the side with better piece coordination, and this queen exchange achieves that. Repositioning the rook to the open file immediately aims to challenge Black's passive piece placement and gain control of central lines. Reclaiming the open d-file with this rook solidifies Black's central presence and prepares for potential queenside pressure. Exchanging rooks now simplifies the position, opening the d-file and presenting a potential queenside initiative. Accepting the exchange simplifies the position, transitioning towards an endgame where controlling open files becomes paramount. Solidifying the pawn structure grants the king a bit more breathing room from any potential diagonal threats. Introducing a knight to d3 injects immediate tension, threatening to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially exploit the open central files for long-term pressure. Seeking to exploit the open files and potential pawn storm, white pushes forward to assert dominion over the center. Disrupting the pawn chain's structural integrity, this subtle move prepares for future pawn advances and potentially opens a diagonal for the queen. Reclaiming the open file, the rook now eyes the central squares and prepares for potential pawn advances. Relocating the monarch towards the center asserts control over vital squares and prepares for potential pawn advances or defensive maneuvering. Reclaiming the open file with the rook signals an intention to contest central space and potentially generate pressure on the king side. Repositioning the bishop to the active diagonal to eye white's queenside pawns. Simplifying the position, this exchange liberates the c-file and forces black's knight from its outpost. Reclaiming the pawn solidifies your queenside presence and activates the rook, but it opens lines for white's pieces. Fortifying the knight on b6, this redeployment aims to control the open queenside files. Asserting control of the c5 square opens avenues for the knight to infiltrate white's position. Unleashing the pawn chain, white aims to disrupt black's queenside coordination. The bishop seeks safer pastures, avoiding the advancing pawn storm. Putting the king on a more active square, the monarch begins a journey toward the center, aiming to influence the remaining play. Reactivating the rook on the open file is crucial for challenging white's pawn structure and preparing for endgame activity. Securing the king on a more active square allows for future piece repositioning and potential central pawn advances. Undermining king's safety with pawn advances often invites counterplay. Be wary of creating weaknesses around your monarch. Opening the king's file will allow rook activation, potentially creating immediate threats against the vulnerable black monarch. Consolidating the monarch's safety becomes paramount now. The king tentatively steps out from its defensive shell. Unleashing the knight to its most active square offers newfound central control and attacking potential. Solidifying the pawn structure, this move shores up the weak e-pawn, aiming to create counterplay on the king side. Repositioning the rook to the fourth rank initiates a quiet struggle for space, preparing to contest the central files and potentially launch a flanking maneuver. Relinquishing the central pawn advance, black aims to reposition the rook for counterplay, subtly preparing to contest the d-file. Shifting the bishop to the queenside aims to block black's central pawn push and prepare for a potential kingside expansion later. Re-establishing the knight's foothold on the queenside offers an avenue for potential queenside expansion or a retreat to a safer square. Unlocking the file creates immediate pressure, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive pawn structure. Re-establishing a passed pawn on the queenside after the exchange creates a dynamic imbalance, offering counterplay despite the structural concessions. Dominating the weakened queenside pawn structure, this knight establishes a powerful outpost. Reactivating the knight offers a chance to pressure white's isolated pawns and potentially establish a central foothold. Unlocking the e-file opens lines for your rook and immediately creates aggressive pressure. Embracing the pawn exchange here dramatically simplifies the position, paving the way for an endgame where active piece play will be paramount. The rook's repositioning to the d6 square seizes a crucial open file, menacingly probing black's weakened queenside pawn structure. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside rarely pays off without proper preparation. A more solid defense of the queenside structure would have been prudent. Seizing the open files, white captures the pawn, aiming to exploit black's exposed king and isolated pawns. Shifting the knight to the queenside aims to pressure white's pawns and potentially infiltrate, but neglects the critical central pawn structure. Seizing the open file, white initiates a decisive queenside assault, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure. Opening the h-file now is a desperate gamble, potentially exposing your king further if white's attack finds traction. Unleashing the knight to a more active outpost now, exploiting the open files.